So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the latest webinar in the MHHS Webinar Series. This webinar will be focusing on the change of supplier process. If you could flick to the next slide, please, Matt. So I shall be running through an introduction before passing over to my colleague, Matt Hall, who will present the walkthrough of the change of supplier process. So following the IPA's recommendation around CR36, Matt will be presenting an end-to-end walkthrough of the change of supply process, whilst looking at the areas that have been impacted by CR36. This webinar will not be covering the CR36 appeal, the change process, or the wider industry. We reached out to participants ahead of the webinar requesting questions to be sent into the PPC team for us to include in the presentation. And we also encourage engagement during the webinar via Slido using the hashtag MHHS, which we will be using to produce an FAQ document following the webinar, and this will be shared later in the week and next week. This webinar is also being recorded, and both the recording and the slides will be uploaded to the MHHS website and collaboration base later today. I will now pass over to Matt. You're on mute, Matt.
It's a good start. Thanks, Alice. So thank you guys for dialing in to the change of supplier walkthrough. The objective of this webinar is to ensure that participants who attend the session have a common understanding of the change of supply process, as well as to kind of support you guys in your design, build and test activities. I am going to walk you through the change of supply process, a level up from the business process maps that have been published as part of the design artifacts. And I'm going to discuss core elements of the process with a particular focus on areas that have been touched by or have been perceived to have been touched by CR36. And then everything within this document has been drawn from design artifacts that have already been published. All of this information is on the MHHS website. As Alice has suggested, any questions, if you could raise them via Slido, and we'll pick them up and respond to them offline. Thank you. Okay, so the change of supplier process really splits into 4 separate stages. One is the change of supplier, the next is the change of agents, and then there are processing reads and processing consumption data. I'm going to step through each of these in a little bit more detail and hopefully address each one of those. So, change of supplier process. There are various industry roles involved within this process. I've listed those out on the left. There are some active industry roles who participate within the process, those being the customers, the suppliers, registration service, central switching service, and the metering service, although the metering services are involved in the MPAN creation element of the change of supply process, and I'm not going to touch on that today. And then there are some informed industry roles, so central settlements, LDSOs, and EES. They receive information about the process, but they don't actively participate within it. On the right-hand side, you can see the key business process artifacts or business design artifacts that are involved in this, and the MHHS interfaces that are also key within these processes. And again, I won't be touching on IF50 because it's related to the MPAN creation event in this process. Switching supplier. So this all starts with a customer asking to change supplier, from which the incoming supplier who's being requested to pick up supply sends a switch request to the central switching service. On receipt of this CSS will send notification of switch request to the existing supplier, which triggers the opening of an objection window, during which time the existing supplier may object if they've got valid cause. But at the same time as sending notification of switch request, CSS also notifies the registration service, who in turn send an IF2, the information or site information to the new supplier. This allows the new supplier to trigger the rest of the change supply process if they should choose so. After the objection window is closed, and assuming no valid objection has been received, a cost secured notification will be sent. and that will be sent to the new supplier, to the registration service and EES, and a notification of loss would be sent to the old supplier by CSS. On receipt of this cost secured notification, the registration service sends a new supplier notification out, and that's on the if1. That will go to the new supplier, to central settlements, and to LDSOs. The key thing, I guess, in terms of timing for this is to say that suppliers are registered at midnight clock time, and that's in alignment with or in accordance to the current convention defined within CSS. Okay, stepping on to the change of agents. Again, so active industry roles within this process are the incoming supplier, the registration service, the metering services, and the data services. And informed industry roles are LDSOs and EES. So again, receiving information about the process but not contributing directly to it. So this process starts with the supplier requesting an MS appointment. Sorry, it's the metering service appointment one. And they'll request that on the IF31. The registration service will validate and respond on the IF32. Assuming that is all valid and that everyone's happy to proceed, then the registration service will also issue a proposed appointment request on the IF33 to the proposed metering service. The proposed metering service will then respond on the IF34, and the registration service will issue an appointment request response, the IF35, regardless of what that response is from the metering service. Now, assuming a positive response from the metering service, then the registration service will issue a de-appointment notification on the IF37. They'll issue that one out to the outgoing metering service, to the outgoing supplier, to LDSO, and to EES. They will also issue notification of appointment on the IF36 to the incoming metering service. And that interface will also be sent out to both suppliers, to the data service, to the LDSO, and to EES. Metering services are appointed at midnight clock time in alignment with supplier registration, as they are today. The change of data service follows very much the same process. So the supplier requests a data service appointment on the IF31. The registration service validates and responds on the 32. And then the proposed appointment request is sent on the 33, and the data service responds on an IF34. Now, assuming, well, regardless of what that response says, registration service issues an appointment request response on the IF35. Again, we're going to assume positive response. So if there is a positive response, then the registration service issues a de-appointment notification on the IF37 to the outgoing data service, to the outgoing supplier, to the LDSO, and to EES. And the registration service issues a notification of appointment to the incoming data service, to both suppliers, to the metering service, to LDSO, and to EES. Similarly to metering services, data services are appointed at midnight clock time in alignment with supplier registration. The difference here is that the outgoing data service is responsible for the collation and publication of consumption data for the full UTC day at the time of the switch. And we'll talk about that in a second, and some of the impacts upon reads and consumption data that has. Okay. Processing COS reads and consumption. I'm going to talk about these together because there's a lot of overlap between the two. So let's step through. Firstly, it's probably worth having a look at this diagram, which identifies the main points of consternation and the reason CR36 was raised in the first place. So suppliers are registered at midnight clock time, but the DCC works at midnight UTC, and that's when smart reads and register reads are made available. So in winter, there is no problem because UTC and GMT align. But in British summertime, there's an hour's misalignment, as is depicted here on the blue and purple squares, with the two red squares, which are The top one is UTC midnight and the bottom one is BST midnight. So you can see there's an hour's gap there, which means during British summertime, when there's a change of ownership, supplier A's ownership period ends at midnight BST, but that is 11 p.m. UTC, which means there are currently 2 half-hourly periods or 2 settlement periods in between, and the reads aren't available until UTC midnight. And this was really the reason that CR36 was raised in the first place, or at least a part of that, and that is part of the crux of the problem that we've had to attempt to resolve through CR36. Okay, so transfer reads. So the smart change of service, change of supplier, cumulative and register reads are readings taken from the meter or readings that have been estimated if there are no valid reads available from the meter and should be considered to have been taken at midnight UTC. For advanced meters, the industry convention that currently exists for advanced meters is to work solely in consumption, although accessing the meter manually isn't prohibited. And this arrangement will remain the same in the MHHS world, so we're not making any changes there. Equally, for traditional meters, the existing processes using D10s will continue, with the outgoing data service responsible for managing and distributing the reads. Transfer reads for smart meters, and this is one of the areas that we've had to clarify through CR36, but actually hasn't changed from the baseline design that was agreed before. So I'm just going to step through each bit. But the first thing to note is that both suppliers and both data services will have access to the consumption and register reads at midnight UTC on the day of the switch. Now, the outgoing data service. So where available, the outgoing data service will publish actual consumption register reads on the IF41, and that will go to the outgoing data service, the incoming data service, the outgoing supplier, and the incoming supplier. And where actuals aren't available, the outgoing data service will generate estimated cumulative reads and register reads and issue those on the IF41. The incoming data service will compare and validate the pub41 they received from the outgoing data service against the reads they've been able to recover from the meter, and will send their own IF41 to the incoming supplier. The outgoing supplier will compare and validate the pub41 they received from the outgoing data service against the reads they've received from the meter, or the reads that they've estimated, and will send a D10 to the incoming supplier, which means the incoming supplier receives 2 pub41s and 1 D10 and evaluates them. Now, in most cases, those will all align, but the incoming supplier has the option to initiate the D300 process if there is any concern around the consistency of readings or consumption data available to them across those 3 files. And on to consumption data. The outgoing data service, as I said earlier, is responsible for the collation and the publication of consumption data for the full UTC day of the switch. And we know, because we've seen the diagram, that during British summertime, that means that there are 2 suppliers that could need to receive some of that data, which means that we need to split the IF21 when we do a change of supplier during the British summertime. So the consumption data for the settlement periods prior to the appointment of the data service will go to the outgoing supplier on an IF21. And the consumption data between the de-appointment and the end of the UTC day of that switch should be shared with the incoming supplier and the incoming data service. There's one exception to this, which is where there is no outgoing data service, for example, at migration or at MPAN creation. In this instance, the incoming data service will be responsible for sending the IF21 through. All IF21s should also be routed to Electional Central Settlements, and MDS and LSS will accept data from the incoming data service where there is no outgoing data service. And finally, to facilitate correct routing of the IF21, we're making block B2, which is the incoming supplier information, mandatory in the IF31 when there's a data service de-appointment event and the reason code is CSUP, which is change of supplier. Okay. So as a quick summary of the solution introduced by CR36, because I know that's hot on everyone's mind at the moment. Agent appointment periods are in clock time. That's unchanged from the process today. Agent appointment and supply ownership periods are aligned. Data services are to be responsible for the collation and publication of consumption for the full UTC day. This requires the IF21 to be split in the event of a change of supplier during British summertime. And there is no change to the existing change of supplier, change of service read convention as previously described in the baseline design. Settlement is accurate and the consumption data is provided, whether it's actual or estimated, using agreed method statement for each and every half-hourly period within each event, in every event day. Thank you. Okay, so the objective of this webinar was to ensure participants who attend the session have a common understanding of the process and to support your design, build and test activities. I'm hoping that through talking through all this, I've helped that in some way. And the next steps, as we alluded to earlier, the slides and the recording will be uploaded onto the MHHS website later today. And the questions will be exported from Slido and answered through an FAQ document, which will be shared next week. Thank you very much for your time today. And that is the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks everyone for joining.